Now that we have our within-group proportions based on the outcome, we can conduct a chi-square test of independence. So when we're talking about a test of statistical independence, we're talking about whether or not two groups are independent if the conditional distributions of the population are identical across categories. Now, I know that sounds a little bit tricky, but essentially what we're saying is that events can be logically or physically independent, but still be statistically dependent. Now, it might seem a little bit more clear how your political preferences could impact the likelihood that you are a Democrat and support an abortion policy, but there are some trickier examples where you might have a student who scores 700 or more on the math portion of the SAT, and you can also have another event be attending Emory. Now, these are kind of logically independent, right? Like having above 700 on the math portion of the SAT doesn't necessarily imply that you attend Emory, but it is quite true that if you likely attend Emory already, that you scored above 700 on the math SAT, and that's just going to be a higher likelihood in general than scoring 700 on the SAT in the average population, right? Like people who are at Emory are just more likely to have higher grades because they're at Emory. So these are statistically dependent, even though they may be logically independent. In order to set up a chi-square test of independence, we again are going to be using a hypothesis testing framework such that our null hypothesis is that the variables are statistically independent. So if we have sufficient evidence to reject the null, we may be more confident to say that the variables are statistically dependent. So we're going to calculate a test statistic that is chi-squared distributed, and there are a little bit of weird nuances about that we're going to talk about, but you're going to have a chi-square statistic that references the chi-square distribution. And essentially what we're going to do is have two different counts within each cell. We're going to have the observed frequency, the actual amount, the number, not the proportion that we observed, and then we have what we would have expected if the samples were independent, right? And the way we're going to calculate that is just going to be the row total divided by the grand total times the column total. So if the null hypothesis is true, we would expect our observed frequency to equal our expected frequency under the null. There's nothing too special that we have to consider in order to get our chi-square statistic. Again, this is very similar to doing any difference between two groups. We're going to look at the squared difference, right? Because we are indifferent as to whether it's above or below. We just care how far away it is. And we're going to take that over the expectation, and then we're going to sum that up for all of the different cells within our contingency table. And that's going to lead to our chi-square statistic. In the context of our example, remember, here is the observed frequencies that we had from the previous slides. So now we can calculate the expected values as well. Remember, the expected value for each cell is the row total over the grand total times the column total. So for that first cell, the expected count of Democrats that say yes is 342.12. So if we continue that for all the different cells in our table, we can have both the observed frequency as well as the expected, and then go ahead and calculate the sum of all of those squared deviations, right? Once we go ahead and get all of the summed squared residuals here, we get a chi-square statistic of approximately 19.79, Now, there are some nuances to this distribution that make it such that I can't necessarily just look at it right off the bat and say, is that a big enough test statistic to likely reject our null hypothesis? And that's largely because the chi-square distribution changes so much based on the degrees of freedom. So we really need to go to R in order to calculate this properly. So the first thing that we're going to need in order to do this in R is we're going to need to know what the degrees of freedom are. And just kind of to remind you what the characteristics of the chi-square distribution are, is that it's going to be skewed right and strictly positive. A nice kind of like interesting side note is that if we were interested in just seeing the difference of the sample proportions, we could have done a difference between the proportions and used a z-score and referenced a normal distribution. But for the sake of what we're doing, we're going to go ahead and still use the chi-square test of independence. Importantly, I want to note that we're always going to use the upper tail. There's not a two-sided test. Now, another kind of assumption or requirement that we have is that we need to have at least 5 or more observations in each of the cells. We can calculate our degrees of freedom as the rows minus 1 multiplied by the columns minus 1. And in R, the way that we're going to actually get our p-value is reference the chi-square probability distribution. And importantly, remember to include those degrees of freedom and always put lower tail equals false. So now that we know the different steps that we need to take in R, let's do this for our example. The degrees of freedom is 3, and we can perform our p-value by plugging in the test statistic that we calculated before, which was 19.79 with our degrees of freedom, lower tail equals false, and we get an incredibly low p-value, almost 0. This means that we have found evidence to suggest that we can reject the null hypothesis, which means that the two variables are not independent and that they are dependent on each other. Importantly, we want to know where the deviation from independence takes place, which of these cells is really driving the results. This will help us answer why we rejected the null in the first place and help give us some underlying meaning as to the dependencies between the two variables. We are going to do this by constructing standardized residuals. This will essentially allow us to say how far away each of the observed cells is away from the expectation. And we're going to need to find the adjusted residuals. So this is literally just the difference between the observed and the expected over the standard error. The denominator is going to be the standard error for the quantity between the observed and expected frequency under the null hypothesis. So for each of these cells, we can go ahead and calculate that standardized residual. So for the first one, with regard to Democrats that said yes, the standardized residual is negative 2.39. We can then go ahead and conduct hypothesis tests as well to see which of these is actually statistically differentiable, right? To see if this is actually where the deviations are taking place with regard to whether these variables are independent or not. Hopefully this makes sense because we really do want to isolate which of these cells is driving the results in giving us an indication that there is a dependency between political preferences and abortion preferences. So to wrap up, we started off talking today about trying to make causal statements through causal inference in the sense that we want to know how variation in a covariate or treatment X impacts variation in some outcome Y. Now, inherently, there are going to be problems with this, and so we talked about 2 different ways that we can go about doing this. When things are, quote, going right, and we have some random assignment of that treatment, then we don't really have to worry about potential confounders, and we can just go ahead and compare those two independent samples. Then we considered conditional distributions in which individuals may have some, underlying preference for their politics that influences what party they prefer as well as their abortion policies. And in those cases, we want to estimate if these two variables are dependent with each other. And in order to do this, we used a chi-square test of independence. And to specifically see which cells were causing deviations, if there is any dependence between the variables, we used standardized residual. Moving forward, when we actually have multiple variables in our regression, we'll talk about different ways to cross off any confounders or other types of potential alternative explanations that would explain the direct relationship between some treatment and the outcome that we're interested in. But that'll come in later modules. As a pleasant reminder, please remember to read all of the suggested and required readings that are online. And if you're reading and listening to this in sequence, please remember that problem set number 2 is due before 8 a.m. before that Monday class on February 15th. As always, these slides are available on Canvas and the course website.